You are very welcome to the Joanna McNicholas podcast, where we will have interesting stories and people from the west of Ireland. And we kick off with the story of Bruce Springsteen's Mayo roots. 2013 was the year of the gathering in Ireland, when the Irish government supported a tourism initiative to encourage the Irish diaspora to return home and celebrate their Irish roots at special events. At that time, I read an interview in a newspaper stating that Bruce Springsteen had McNicholas ancestry, and that was the first time that I had heard that. And as one with the surname myself, I was curious, but it would be several years more before I would begin to research Bruce Springsteen's Mayo roots. The McNicholas name is deeply rooted in South County Mayo, where it is one of the most popular names. There are hundreds of families with that name, especially around the areas of Bohola, Kilchima, Swinford and Ball. I found information online relating to one of Springsteen's ancestral lineages, which named an ancestor, Anne Geraghty, who came from the Kildare region, but there was very little about the McNicholas side of the family. An item in the Irish Independent in 2016 named Springsteen's ancestor as Richard McNicholas, but there was no mention of where he had come from. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. And after a lot of searching, the most important piece of the puzzle was eventually supplied word of mouth by a couple of local men of McNicholas blood, of course, who had immigrated to the United States in the 1980s. One of them remembered meeting an older County Mayo immigrant, also a McNicholas, of course, who was from the same townland as Springsteen's ancestors. I had found the missing piece of the jigsaw, but were there any historical records to support this? Then, armed with the information that I had gathered, the next step was to consult genealogist and historian Ger Delaney of the South Mayo Family Research Centre in Ballinrobe, a small town situated in South Mayo, not far from the Galway border. How are you, Jerry?
Hello, Joanna. How are you?
That's Ger Delaney. On Ger's desk, there is a variety of historical records relating to Bruce Springsteen's ancestry, including copies of newspaper cuttings from Ireland and the United States, a shipping record, a copy of Griffith's valuation, and some American census reports.
My name is Ger Delaney. I am the manager of the South Mayo Family Research Centre in Ballinrobe, and I have a lifelong interest in history and genealogy. I have a master's degree in local history, and I spent quite an amount of the time researching families for people of Mayo origin who have immigrated overseas.
So what kind of records do you actually keep here?
We have a variety of records here. Church records from the 19th century, civil records from the 19th century, land records. We also have access to the 1901 and 1911 census, gravestone inscriptions. We've read all the older gravestones in South Mayo, and lots of land records as well. Plus, over the years, we've accumulated a lot of material that has come back from overseas, from people who immigrated overseas and who are sending back information about their families.
How far back do the records actually go? Because some of the records were lost along the way, weren't they?
Yes, the 19th century census returns were more or less completely lost in the Public Records Office fire in 1922 at the outbreak of the Civil War. But that doesn't, apart from the loss of the census record, for Roman Catholic families, nothing else of any major importance was lost at that time. Church records have different starting dates. In cities across the country, they go back into the 16 and 1700s, but in the west of Ireland, the church records, the Roman Catholic church records, virtually all start after Catholic emancipation, which happened at the end of the 1820s. So depending on the parish your people are from, the starting dates may vary. For instance, the Roman Catholic parish of Crossboyne, just out the road from here, the records start in 1791 there, but if you go across the fields into the parish of Kilvine, records don't start there till 1872, which is several generations later.
Now, we know that Mayo is divided into two different areas for these family research purposes. Can you give us an idea of how it's divided between the North Mayo Centre and the South Mayo Centre?
Yeah, ourselves and our colleagues at the North Mayo Centre divided the county on the old parliamentary constituency line, which had roughly the same population either side of the line at the end of the 19th century. The line basically starts in the parish of Kilmena and runs across the county, with Castlebar being in the southern half, right across to the eastern part of the county, with Kilkelly being in the southern part and Knock Airport just up the road being in the northern part of the county. So in the end of the 19th century, the population either side of the line was almost the same.
So if somebody wanted their records and they weren't sure, they'd just have to either get onto you here or the North Mayo Centre.
Oh yes, this happens all the time, because a lot of people don't know where in Mayo their people were from. So if we get an inquiry for North Mayo, we pass it on, and they do likewise for us.
We have some interesting people who already have connections here. So there are some famous people.
Lots of famous people, I suppose. Mrs. Richard Nixon, for instance, she was one of the early roots hunting visitors to Mayo. She came in 1973.
Is that President Nixon?
President Nixon's wife. He was visiting Ireland at the time. Obviously, it's all in connection with political promotion in America, no more than the recent visit of Joe Biden. This clicking in with the Irish diaspora in the States is a done thing in the run-up to American elections. She came in 73. Other people not involved in politics would include people like Michael Flatley. Mary Robinson, of course, was born here. There's lots of famous people with Mayo roots going back over the decades and go back over the century.
We're coming to our big star that we really want to talk about today, and that is Bruce Springsteen and his McNicholas ancestry, whom he mentions so many times. So can you give us an idea about the name for a start, the McNicholas name? Have you any idea when it came here?
Yes, McNicholas is one of the branches of the De Burghs. The De Burghs came to Ireland, Norman family, in the 1200s and spread across much of the west of Ireland. And as the generations passed, they subdivided the name. Some of them stuck to the original De Burgh, or Burke as it is now, or De Burca as it is in Irish, but other branches included names like Gibbons, Jennings, MacWalter, Philbin. They're all branches of the same Burke dynasty, and the McNicholses are also a branch of the Burkes. McNicholas means obviously son of Nicholas, and they are descended from a Nicholas Burke who was around in the 1300s. And the name then gets further anglicised in the case of some immigrants as Nicholson, and this pertains in the case of Bruce Springsteen, one of the early records of his family, which we'll talk about in a moment. The surname is confined almost completely to South Mayo, and at the time of King James I, 400 years ago now, or close to it, the McNicholses owned quite a tranche of land from what is now Bahola to Culchma, that area there, and it's from that area that Bruce Springsteen's ancestors hail.
So me being a McNicholas as well, and Bruce Springsteen being a McNicholas, we would go back to that source probably.
Yes, and at some point you would have a common ancestor who would be a McNicholas, and whose people before that were branches of the Burkes. So a DNA test will establish maybe how closely Bruce and yourself are related.
Okay, well, So what information do you actually have here now on Bruce? Because we have traced him back to a Richard McNicholas from Thrinaglera townland in Kilchima.
Yes. Now the church records in Kilchima don't go back to when that Richard McNicholas was born. But we're fortunate that there's a fortunate accident on our behalf. In the 19th century, lots of Irish immigrants to the States got lost connection with home or with other relatives who'd immigrated. And various Irish newspapers in the States carried ads looking for information on lost relatives. And the foremost of these newspapers was a newspaper belonging to the Diocese of Boston called the Boston Pilot. And for much of the 19th century, it was edited by a man called John Boyle O'Reilly, who was a famous Irish nationalist who was exiled from here back in the 1860s or 1870s. Anyway, in 1867, there's an ad in the Boston Pilot which reads, "Of Richard Nicholson," you see the anglicisation of the name there, "of Thrinaglera, parish of Killaden, County Mayo, Ireland, who came to America 16 years ago, when last heard of was in Old Bridge, Middlesex, in Monmouth County, New Jersey. Any information of him will be thankfully received by his brother James Nicholson in Michigan." Now, the full address is there for James in Michigan. Now, this is the anglicisation, as I mentioned earlier on, of the surname. But when we take 16 years from 1867, we see 1851, which is the year that Richard McNicholas or Nicholson immigrated from Thrinaglera. And when we then take a look at shipping records, which we have access to a large number of them from that period, we find a boat which sailed from Liverpool on the 1st of February 1851 and landed 2 months later in Baltimore. And by landed, I mean it hit the shore and some people got killed in the process. But anyway, on that boat, among the 200 and something people, we find Richard McNicholas, a labourer, and Anne McNicholas, a spinster. Richard was aged 20 and she was 21. So they weren't husband and wife, but the chances are they were probably brother and sister. And they arrived in Baltimore, Maryland, on the 17th of March. Now, when the ship was approaching the docks in Baltimore, it actually was blown off course, and it foundered and hit the rocks on Cape Henry, which is just on the edge of Baltimore harbour. All the passengers on board got off safely except five. 5 were drowned after that long sea journey from Ireland. They made it almost to the shore and then got drowned. That abstract on that incident was found in a newspaper which we've access to here called the Sailor's Magazine and Naval Journal, which was published in New York in 1851.
And do you have a name for that ship?
We do have a name for the ship. Let me see now where it is. It's called the Robina, R-O-B-E-N-A. I've seen it also spelled R-O-B-I-N-A on some occasions. But it left Liverpool on the 1st of February 1851. Like many of the ships that left Liverpool, landed in Ireland and then took on passengers. But I think in this case that Richard McNicholas and his sister had actually travelled to Liverpool when they got on the boat. And the big question is, were they one of the many McNicholases who were evicted from Thrinaglera by Lord Lucan? There were 2 sets of evictions from Thrinaglera. 50 families were evicted in 1844, numbering between 250 and 300 people. And a second set of evictions took place at the height of the famine. And there was a letter written at the time from Father Malarkey, parish priest in Killaden, who wrote to one of the Dublin newspapers, and he gave a frightful account of the extermination that went on in the parish at the time. He said, "The sheriff with a strong force of police arrived in the townland of Thrinaglera, parish of Killaden, County Mayo, with strict orders from the landlord, Lord Lucan, to execute the law by evicting the poor inhabitants. The townland is now made the theatre of many a melancholy and heart-rending scene. The whole townland, I might say, presents the appearance of a battlefield the day after the fight. Nothing to be seen but the shattered ruins of what so lately were the abodes of men. No less than 33 families, numbering in all 145 human beings, have been thrown on the world. It would be impossible for me, sir, to give you a full and fair description of the wretched and deplorable condition of these unfortunate creatures. Stretched along ditches and hedges, many of them children and decrepit old parents, falling victim to cold and hunger and destitution. The same system is in operation in other districts in Mayo, where in one barony in Limerick, upwards of 1,000 houses have been levelled since the month of November last. And that was Trinidad evictions of the winter of 1848. And among the MacNicholases who were evicted at that stage, we know of 3. There was a widow MacNicholas who had 6 in her family, a Pat MacNicholas who had 7 in his family, and a Patrick J. MacNicholas who had 4 in his family. And it's quite possible that Richard MacNicholas, the ancestor of Bruce Springsteen, was a member of one of those 3 families that made their way to Liverpool and took the boat for America.
Now, there were a lot of MacNicholas families there at the time.
A lot more than, and even after the clearances, there were still this bunch of MacNicholases left in Trinidad. This is why it's a minefield. Like there was Margaret, John, Walter, Stephen. Each of these had houses: Tom, Bridget, and Andrew.
And they were after.
After in 1856.
So everybody in that village then must have been called MacNicholas.
No, there was Highlands. Highlands was another name in it. Yeah. Look what they had. Look. 16 acres, 16 acres, 16 acres, 27 acres, 18 acres, 9 acres, 26 acres, 16 acres.
And they were all tenants of Lord Lucan.
All tenants of Lord Lucan, yeah. There was an agent, he was Lindsay from Hollymount. He sublet half of Trinidad from Lucan in, let's say, 1820. Now at that time, most land was let for 31 years. And the 31 years seems to have ended up in the middle of the 1840s, so perhaps it was let in the 1810s. And this is why the first set of clearances happened, because the leases had run out.
So we have no way of being absolutely sure that it was some of Springsteen's relatives that were evicted, but there's a strong possibility.
There's a strong possibility that they were, given the evictions of 1848 and the fact that they sailed from Liverpool in 1851, just at the end of the Great Famine.
So the timing would have been.
Yeah.
And do you have any more information about Lord Lucan?
Lots of information available on Lord Lucan and his family. They've been here since the time of Queen Elizabeth. They owned a very large amount of land in South Mayo and several townlands in East Mayo as well. And at the time of the famine, they cleared a huge area here in Ballinrobe, an area that's still called the farm, and several townlands were cleared off, and the land was leased out to a Scottish farmer who ran a fairly modern farm for the time that was in it, fairly efficiently, brought in his own labourers, nearly all Presbyterians, and they founded the Presbyterian Church in Hollymount, because there were so many, there's 54 families I think at one stage working on the farm. The problem that Lucan had and that other landlords had at the time, and many of them went broke, remember, is that when tenants couldn't pay their rent, the landlord had no income, and the landlord needed a certain level of income to maintain the standard of living that they were accustomed to. Like they would have employed people in their houses, they would have lived a high life in Dublin and in London. All this cost money, and many of them were mortgaged to the hilt, so mortgages needed to be repaid as well. So when the cash flow stopped, many landlords saw it better to replace tenants who sometimes couldn't pay their rent with animals which could always be sold when they were 2 or 3 years of age and bring in an income. So they looked at it purely from a monetary point of view.
And that line of Lord Lucan has now finished?
That line of Lord Lucan, the direct line of Lord Lucan has finished, at least the title is finished. The last Lord Lucan hit the tabloids in England in the 1960s over the sudden disappearance or the killing of his children's nanny, and he hasn't been seen or heard from since.
And that was the end of the Lucans?
Yeah.
And that's it for today's episode. We will be back again tomorrow with part 2 of the Bruce Springsteen Mayo Roots. Thanks for listening.